Hello, I'm Marcelo, the show host. The show you're about to listen was recorded in December 20th, 2012. And it's only seeing the light of day now because I kind of lost the file. And when I finally found it, I remembered it was a mess. We had connection problems, my microphone was throwing a tantrum, so I took my time, stitched the audio together, and you're finally having the opportunity of listening to Sean Nittner from the Narrative Control podcast, talking about podcasting, narrative control, and player agency. Enjoy. Narrative Control with Sean Nittner. Hello, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Marcelo. How about yourself?
I'm good. I hope you don't mind the accent. And
no, not at all.
If there's anything you don't understand, please ask. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm one of those very good coaches who didn't used to be very good at playing basketball or baseball, but became a hell of a coach. I am very good at teaching people how to pronounce well in English, although I don't pronounce it very well myself. I think it's because I only manage to talk English, 4 to 8 hours a week. You have an advantage of me. You speak English, 24 hours, 16 hours a day?
Something like that. Well, I talk in my sleep, so possibly more.
Right.
Yes, but for speaking it as infrequently as you do, you sound fantastic. And tell me, is Marcelo the correct pronunciation of your name? Is it Marcello? Am I getting it right?
Marcelo is perfect. Marcello is too Italian.
Okay.
And my last name is actually French-Portuguese, so I think Marcelo is best.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll stick with that.
One thing people love to do is writing my name with 2 L's. Is it very common, people being called Marcelo in English with 2 L's?
Yes. Yeah. You just told me your name, and I spell it. I would have put 2 L's.
Okay, so I need to introduce myself by always saying, hello, my name is Marcelo with 1 L.
Well, my last name is Nittner, which is Austrian and ugly, and it's mine. And it's even uncommon in Austria. I mean, nobody has the name Nittner. There's about 3 Nittners in the United States. And somehow people always hear it Nitter without the second N. So you're Marcelo with only 1 L, and I'm Nittner with 2 N's.
Interesting. Well, let's start about talking of Narrative Control, the podcast.
Wonderful.
When did it start, and why did it start?
When did it start? Let me see. Let me go back to my website and check a date here so that I know when it started.
I think it's 2007.
It started, yes, actually 2008 was our first episode. August 27th of 2008 was the first episode. So it's been going on and off. Wow, 4 years, crazy. So yeah, it started in 2008, and it was specifically in the wake of several podcasts that I admired very much. The Durham 3, Sons of Cryos, and Gamer the Podcasting, and Have Games Will Travel. Those were podcasts that I listened to religiously, and I really loved their take. But I kept finding myself saying, no, what about this? Or, oh yeah, and then also there was this other experience. And, having a general experience of talking to myself while in the car listening to a podcast. And eventually I decided that there were several points that I did really want to address. And I contemplated trying to get on to other people's podcasts to talk to them, but I didn't think anyone would know who I was. So instead I made a podcast of my own, where I was able to, bring up my thoughts, sort of my reflections on my gaming experiences and what had worked for me and what hadn't. And I was still running into frustrations, because I still think gamer 25 years into it, there are certain things that I haven't quite figured out how I want to, how to make work just right. So, it's for me a way to continue that discussion about, reaching gamer nirvana.
I don't know if you know it, but your podcast is one of the inspirations for my podcasting experience. I started listening to podcasts, I think, early 2008, maybe late 2007. And I remember finding your podcast, I think around September, maybe August of 2008. So I'm listening to you pretty much from the beginning. And by October of 2008, my experience was pretty much like yours. I caught myself myself, talking to myself, answering, or talking to the people, to the podcast I was listening to. And I decided, wait a minute, if they can do it, I can do it.
Absolutely. Well, I'm honored to hear that. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's funny. I think that there's been, I'm not really even current with the trends, but I know as of 2008, I really felt like there was a sort of second generation of gaming podcasts where the first generation, my inspirations were very information based. They were like, we're going to talk about this episode, we're going to talk about this game or this technique or this system, and we're going to analyze it and break it down. And then I think a whole new wave of podcasts came out after that were really just like a talk show, a podcast where people just got on and kind of talked bull about whatever, they would start with a topic, but it would just kind of go anywhere, and it might end up being a discussion about what they ate or what shows they like. And for me, I really admired that sort of first generation that was very focused. And so that's always been my aspiration, is to try and keep with a few exceptions. We have a couple episodes, notably like the drunk episode, where we really veered all over the place. But my goal is really to try and stay on a particular topic and really analyze it. So if I give you any kind of inspiration to get started, I'm delighted. Even if it was just arguing with me as you listen to the show. No, he's got it wrong. That's fine too.
I managed to use a couple of your ideas. I don't know if you remember, one of the very first ideas of that year was you would ask one of the idea is the GM would ask one of the players to do a teaser, just say something for next session. And I think your example was two blades crossing on top of a ravine, something like that. So you would try to work it in your next session. I actually used that.
That's awesome. How did it work for you?
It worked well for a couple of maybe 3 sessions. Then my players started trying to break it, trying to do things that in a way that they would start
trying to break it.
Yeah, trying to use that as a hack, a way to meta hacking into the game in order to get advantage. I would hear things, and we find a cache of weapons, and no.
Right. Well, see, so then you get into the point of, social contract where we're asking, what is it we're sitting at this table to do? Is it for me to give you challenges and you to kill things to take their stuff? And is that the fun we're going to have? Or is the fun we're going to have you giving me complicated characters that I will put in complicated situations and we all figure out how they get through them? And that's unfortunately the best tools out there, if used out of context or used as a hack, as it were, will always backfire. I found a lot of time that something I think works great, I'll take a con game with people I don't know, and suddenly it'll backfire on me, and I'm like, how did that happen? Why didn't that work? And it's all just about what's going on at the table and what people are interested in.
I don't know if it was because of it. I think it was, but by then I was playing with a group of teenagers, so I'm not playing with them any longer. And nowadays I play. My group is kind of in a state of flux. I used to have a group of friends that I used to play with. They became my second team, my second group of co-hosts, recording my Portuguese language podcast. And they were those kind of guys. They were those kind of guys that would create complications for themselves.
Right.
And if I did something like, your spaceship gets intercepted by a battle cruiser, and in the screen it appears a captain. He has a thick beard, except for an area where they have a scar, where he has a scar. You know them. What can you tell me about them? If I would give them that kind of narrative control, 9 out of 10 times they would say, we made that scar, he hates us, instead of saying he's a friend.
Right. Because I gave him that scar. He hates me is a much better story, especially when they're outgunned and outclassed than he's our buddy.
Yeah. But we are entering the territory of narrative control, the concept. Let's back a little and talk about narrative control, the podcast. You have a tendency of changing, if not formats, but of changing co-hosts year after year, right? Is it something you do on purpose? Is it dangerous? Is it dangerous becoming one of your co-hosts?
Is it dangerous? Yeah, they don't last long. Yes. Well, I do change the format of the show every season. Every 33 episodes, we get a new format. So the first one was all about our gaming experiences, and I figured after telling you about 33 of my personal games, that was enough. The next one was The Conversation Continues, which is us taking interesting things people said on the internet and commenting on them. And things were sometimes gaming related and sometimes not, but they were things that we thought had an interesting application towards gaming regardless. And then the third season has been my attempt at Car Talk, the podcast, or RPG Talk, the podcast for that, and really, where we take people getting on the show, asking us how we would handle a certain situation, and if we feel like we're capable of answering it, we accept the question, and then we get them on the air and then we talk about it. The third season has been much more difficult because it is dependent upon finding someone who has a question and it being one that we feel like we can answer, and one that we don't think is going to be answered with talk to your players. That's kind of an old saw, and I think we've said it so many times on the show that if a topic ever gets anywhere close to that, I start getting like my skin starts itching because I can tell I'm repeating myself. So the show format is very intentionally changed every season. The hosts not as such. Justin, who was my original co-host, after Gen Con 2007, Gen Con 2009, his life got very, very busy. He was planning on having a child, which he did. Congratulations. And his job changed, and sort of his time for gaming and gaming related activities really diminished. And so for a while we were trying to work it out. I was driving to his place and we were recording in his place, but eventually we realized that time was sort of prohibitive. And so I found a friend of mine, Eric Fadig, who I had sat and had a ton of really enjoyable conversations with. We'd sat around talking about gaming, and I thought, generally my qualification for having a host is, have I sat down and yacked for hours on end about some topic on gaming with you, and have I really, really enjoyed it and thought you had something insightful to say? If so, I'll probably approach you to be a host with me on the show at some point. And I got Fadig on for season 2. For season 3, I had already brought Lenny on the show once or twice. I think twice, but one of them didn't get aired. I had brought him on the show and really enjoyed his repartee. And actually, it really actually started. The idea of it started with a friend of mine, Joe Harney, who has been on season 3, hitting me up over Skype at one point saying, I have this question about Dresden Files. And I was like, hey, I'm talking to Lenny right now. Let me just put all 3 of us on and we'll talk about it, because he wrote the game. And we had this conversation. And I thought, wow, this conversation would have been great to put on the air. Let's do that. And so Lenny and the idea of having a card talk like episode where someone calls in and asks for advice and we give them, our 2 cents. We're all sort of tied hand in hand. So I asked him to come on season 3 to do that format.
Cool. If a person decides to be an RPG podcaster, or if they already are an RPG podcaster, how many hours of gaming do you think they should have a week? Do you think they should have 1 session a week, 2 sessions a week? Because you need to be playing in order to be talking about game, right? Before you answer the question, let me explain to you from where I'm coming from. My 2011 season was more like an in and off season. I didn't have much time to record. I was without a fixed, a regular gaming group. I didn't have any fixed co-hosts, so I didn't publish as many episodes as I wanted to publish, to put on air. I think saying publish in English is weird. It seems like I'm publishing a book and airing episodes. And I realized I didn't have through my 2009, 2010, and I said 2011 season. my 2012 season was on and off. Through my first 3 seasons, 2009, 10, and 11, I talked a lot. I covered many subjects, as much as I could. And by the 2012 season, I realized, as I wasn't playing as much and as a variety of games, like my few games a week, a month would be D&D. I didn't have many subjects to talk about. I didn't have many games under my belt that I hadn't already used as examples ad nauseum. So I realized I needed to diversify, play different games, and play more often, including board games, because my podcast on 2012 really became a hobby gaming podcast. I play as many board games and card games and dice games as I play role-playing games. So I realized I needed to play more to have what to talk about. But this is a personal experience. What do you think?
Well, I think, let me ask you a question real quick. When you were playing less, did you feel that you were sort of checked out of gaming in general, or did you feel like you were still sort of active in social networks, on forums, talking to other people? I mean, did you sort of feel like that by playing less, that just meant that you were less connected to gaming in general?
I think so, because I had less things to talk about. I had less questions and less doubts. I also had less things to contribute to the community, like experiences and ideas.
See, I find for myself, I mean, it's certainly true that if you aren't doing it, you're just going to naturally separate from the activity. I mean, you kind of have to be doing it on a regular basis to stay involved. But I also find that for myself, I kind of go through phases. I mean, that's why there's times when, at times Narrative Control came out as frequently as once a week, and now it's coming out kind of every couple months because, partially because of my schedule, partially because of getting calls. But it really is varied in the frequency, and that's why I've never promised any particular frequency, because I knew I wouldn't be able to deliver on any regular schedule. But I know that for myself, part of the reason why it's varied in release times is that I kind of go through phases of playing a lot and then sort of mulling over that playing a lot and then having something to say about that mulling over. So while I'd agree that you should be gaming always, because, I mean, it's a lot more important to actually be gaming than to be talking about gaming. And then if you don't game, it's going to be hard to discuss it. I don't know that there's necessarily a one-to-one correlation of if you don't game twice a week, you won't be able to put out a podcast that week. Because sometimes the ideas that I put out on a podcast, it might reflect a game I played like a year ago. Sometimes sometimes it hits me quite a bit after the game what went wrong with it, or what went really well, what went really right with it, or like what cool thing about it is worth repeating or sharing. So I don't know that I have a fixed number. I mean, right now I play in something like 4 different games that are sort of scheduled once every other, for the most part scheduled once every other week. Some of them are supposed to be once a week, but we often cancel, so they end up becoming once every other week. So I guess that would be about 2 games a week that I'm playing right now. And I think that gives me plenty of grist for the mill. That gives me plenty of content to sort through and pick out what's interesting. And have something to say not only on the podcast, but also when I get onto forums, when I get onto the Twitters and I'm talking about it. So that's my personal kind of comfort zone is maybe once or twice a week. But again, I don't know that there's necessarily a 100% direct correlation. I think we kind of go through phases of taking in information and analyzing it and then being ready to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, I think every podcast goes through a middle age crisis. Middle age being 4 years on the road, and you have to rethink things. Well,
you're right. I mean, I'm at that state myself right now, where I'm very happy with the way season 3 is working. We haven't been able to kind of roll it out nearly as frequently as I'd like it to.
Yeah, I found myself not being able to record and air shows this year, but I have plans of changing that for my Portuguese podcast, Voices of Third Earth, for 2013, if there is a world left. And even if there isn't, maybe the RPG podcasts could be the voice of the revolution. Remember when on Terminator series, you had the John Connor broadcasting message of hope for the remainder of mankind. Maybe we could do that. The surviving podcast hosts, they could keep airing their podcasts so people know they're still game after the world ends.
I think think if anyone is going to be the voice of the revolution, it's going to have to be Paul Tevis, because not only did he record the podcast Voice of the Revolution, but also he just has that silky smooth voice that manages to pull off a one-man podcast and not have it sound monotone and boring like I find most single. That's why I have a host, is I think it would be boring as hell if someone just listened to 45 minutes of me.
In my case, I need a soundboard. I need people to throw things off at them, and maybe they throw it back at me.
Well, yes, that for sure as well. Definitely.
All right. Let's talk about narrative control, the concept, the idea. When was the first time that you came about it? When you realized that crazy thing? What do you mean narrative control? I am the GM, but I'll relinquish some of my control to petty players. When did the idea, when you came about it and you thought it was a good idea?
So I didn't have words for it at first. I just remember my first experiences when playing D&D, and I think it was second edition, maybe. Yeah, it was late second edition, and maybe it's just when third had come out. But I remember trying to do something, and my character coming off as extremely foolish, and I remember saying, well, I remember thinking that my goal was to be kind of comical, and that my character was trying to lighten up the mood, and instead he got turned into sort of the buffoon, which I suppose is a comic character's role. I suppose that's not necessarily wrong, but I was really frustrated because I had described myself doing something, and then either because of, I don't know, dice rolls or the GM's interpretation, this was me as a player, what actually happened within the fiction was not what I had intended. And I remember kind of fighting, saying, no, my character doesn't do that. No, that's not what I had in mind. And it just sort of falling on deaf ears, like, what are you talking about? This is what happened. Move on. And I remember thinking, as a player, I have a lot of control over how my character stabs things. I can cast spells, I can choose weapons, I can have, powers, feats, whatever. But I have very little control over how the world works around me. And that was extremely frustrating for me because I wanted to have more say in a game. And when I would GM, I would often find that I just felt like I was putting so much energy into making the world rich, and that my players were just kind of being very reactive. And I was like putting all this out there and kind of wanting them to give me feedback, and they really didn't want to do it. In fact, one time I started handing out NPC cards to players and being like, okay, this is the only player that's in the scene. So you other 4 players who your characters aren't in the scene, here's NPCs, and there's like 2 little lines about what they're like. It's like it was just a line that said personality, like a single word, and then motivation, like what they wanted. And I just, here, you play all these NPCs. And I found my players kind of looked at me like deers in headlights. They didn't understand what to do. I'm like, I play NPCs all the time. I have like 100 NPCs in this game. You guys can play one. And they really just weren't interested in it. So I felt like there was something missing, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And then I started hearing the term of narrative control being bandied about, the idea that you pass it around. And I started playing the game Wilderness of Mirrors, where you're rolling for narrative control, and Octane, where you're the same thing. And it wasn't like it was an instant transformation, like my players suddenly magically all wanted to contribute and be part of the story, and that as a player I got to suddenly contribute and magically part of the story. But it started sowing seeds of changing authorities, changing who has authority over what. Instead of this idea that a player only has authority over their character's statistics and few minor actions, that different people might have authority over different parts of the game. And that over several years, I saw that paradigm slowly shifting in my own gaming and hearing about other people doing it, to the idea where you could throw that out there, like the question you said about, you see this captain that's got a scar on it, and you could reasonably expect that your players will come back at you with some awesome backstory about how he got that scar, or about how they're connected. Maybe it was I gave him that scar. Maybe it was he got that scar saving my life and I owe him a life debt. Whatever it was, I think slowly, incrementally, I got to the point where I started feeling like I could expect that.
What is the best game? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, did I answer that question at all in the way you wanted me to, or did I totally blow off the mark?
No, you went even better than I expected. It's good to talk about. It's one of the reasons I like talking. I like making Channel 2 a podcast where I talk about game creators, game writers, hosts and podcast hosts, because I just need to throw a ball on you and you will talk for 10 or 15 minutes. It's awesome. It's every interviewer's dream. It's terrible when you ask a question and then you get an answer like, yep, that was it, and that's the end. It's one of the reasons I interviewed Ron Barton and Ed Healy a couple of weeks ago, because I wanted to know how to interview better. And the best way to interview people is getting guests that like talking about the subject. It makes my work way easier. And you're making my work very, very easy. My next question is, it's a very simple question, but feel free to talk about the game, not just name the game. Which game do you think does a very good job, if not the best job, in terms of narrative control mechanics?
Yes. No, I'm just kidding. So games that I feel like there's two games that I feel like handle narrative control exceptionally well. The first one is Matt Wilson's Primetime Adventures. PTA is excellent in that not only does it expect that players are going to open up scenes and that they're going to direct the scenes. They're going to say what's happening, who's in it. They're going to start the initial trajectory of the scene. It also expects that they're going to take responsibility for making those scenes be about their own, the issues of the characters. So if you're at a low spotlight, if you're spotlight 1, which means you're a supporting cast member, then it's really your responsibility when it comes time to open up a scene that you're going to hit on the issues of the spotlight 3, or the main spotlight character in an episode, as it's called. And so players are really, and they have a lot of tools to do it. They look at their connections, and they look at their edges, and they look at their issues, and they look at their nemesis, and they look at what's happened before. And they have all these sort of things floating about on the table. I often like to play, when I'm playing online, we'll play with a Google drawing that we're all sharing, and on that Google drawing it'll show all the PCs, it'll show all the NPCs, it'll show people's edges, their connections, their threads, their fan mail. So it's really easy to look at that and draw from that to say, oh, we haven't seen your ex-wife in a while, and didn't she get really pissed off at you because you didn't pick up the kids that one time? Let's find out what she's doing, and let's ask a question about that. Let's start a scene about that. So I think PTA not only gives players a lot of great tools to take narrative control, it really requires it of them. And then I think really sort of an evolution from PTA, although it doesn't do everything the same way, but it does a lot of great things, is Fiasco. Because Fiasco encourages you to, again, base scenes off of prompts of what's happened before, what's shared amongst the characters. It has a lot of useful tools, and you generally, when you're picking elements, you write them down on index cards and throw them out on the table so everybody knows what everyone's relationships are and what their needs are. But it also brings in some pacing elements, like you can either open a scene or you can close a scene. You can, if you get a black die, then your scene will end badly for you. If you get a white die, it's going to end well for you. So it has all these constraints to tighten down what kind of scenes you're going to tell. And I'm a huge believer that constraints breed creativity. When you have limited options, you will do cooler things than when you're told, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want.
Can you narrative control any game? Do you think you can insert a narrative control mechanic, or maybe just an idea, just a system, into any game? Or
Sure.
Are there games where narrative control is not such a good idea?
I don't know that every game's narrative control is a really good idea, because I think that some games that are really well designed for handling, investigation and sort of clue discovery. If you're playing Gumshoe and you give players wide breadth of narrative control, they might decide to jump to the end of the clue train and cut out a lot of the game's internal mechanics. If you're playing a horror game and you give somebody total license for narrative control, they could take what is meant to be an isolating, uncomfortable scene of powerlessness and turn it into one of levity because they as a player might feel uncomfortable. So I don't think carte blanche narrative control in every game all the time is always a good idea. I think every game you certainly can pass it around, but I think it's important that you have a social contract of agreeing what's happening in the game, what the game's about, so that people don't use as a tool, like you were mentioning, your players kind of use the the teasers as a tool to kind of get themselves in a better situation or hack the next game. I think it's important that when you hand those reins over, that everyone is kind of agreeing about what people should be doing with them. So in like a horror game, it might be really applicable to say like, he touches you on the shoulder and it makes you feel incredibly uncomfortable. Why is his touch so disturbing to you? That's like a really good question to ask somebody that is in a horror game that they can describe whatever reason they want for his touch to be really unsettling, but they can't say it's not unsettling because that was the question you asked. Similarly, you might say, it's the most grotesque thing you've ever seen at the bottom of the well. What do you do? Where do you find yourself after you run off screaming? Where do you find yourself later? And so again, that's one of those things where you can let the player take a prompt, like you're terrified beyond all belief. What do you do with that? Without totally allowing them to say, oh yeah, I stomach it and climb down the well to investigate this horror. That is really not appropriate to the genre. So yes, I think narrative control can be shared in any game, but I think that depending on the genre of the game or the themes of the game, it's more or less important to make sure everyone's on the same page. If you're playing like a high pulp game that's totally gonzo and you hand over narrative control and they're like, I send in the airships. You're like, great, there weren't airships before, but awesome, there's airships now. That's perfect because this is totally an airship kind of game. But in a more in a more suspenseful or more narrow genre, then I think it's really important to make sure that people, that you give somebody an expectation before you say what happens next.
Got it. What's the difference between narrative control and player agents? I know you're kind of expert in that.
Well, for me, I played a published horror adventure a little while back ago that I wrote about in my actual play, and it was a gumshoe game, so it was meant to be investigative, but it was a Trail of Cthulhu game. It's clearly a horror game, and we were all patients in a hospital, not a mental hospital, mind you, just a regular hospital, and we were essentially
is
trapped.
Scary enough.
Yeah, exactly. We were all trapped there and being experimented on and whatnot. And the moment where I realized that we lost agency as players is when we had more than one scene in a row of our characters witnessing atrocious things happening to others or to themselves and not being able to take any action, not being able to contest that or affect that. So I always see the players as the protagonists of whatever story they're in, even if you're like the serfs and there's a war going on, and the war is about, the war has the king and these great warriors and all this stuff, and you're just two like serfs whose masters have been killed, and now you're roaming the lands with no land to work and no home to call your own. The story is still about you. Like, it's always about whatever you're doing. That's where the camera is sitting, and the war is the backdrop, the king and the great warriors the backdrop to your personal dramas. So for me, as long as the characters are able to have effect on the world that they're in, whatever that world may be, again, if you're just two lowly serfs meandering the countryside, then that world may be, do you help the guy whose leg is trapped under his wagon, and do you get him aid? Do you fend off the bandits that are going to take his things? Do you manage to find somebody that'll take you in and give you shelter for the night? Do you make friends with the locals, or do they cast you out as enemies? As long as you're able to have some control over what's going on in your lives, then my feeling about player agency is satisfied. When players aren't able to make any important effect changes on what's going on in the story, then I'm like, what are we doing here? I'm just spinning wheels. Like, no matter what I do, you're gonna give me the same results. I don't feel like I'm playing this game. I just feel like I'm doing some kind of call and response where you ask me what I do and it doesn't matter what I say because you're just gonna tell me what happens next, and then I start losing my mind.
All right. So very different concept. Now, something else about narrative control. In my personal experience, narrative control is easier when the game is preset for it. When the game supports narrative control, is a lot of the responsibility for having a good game with narrative control is in the game. But a lot of the responsibility lies in the hands of the players. If you have a good narrative control game and bad players, you won't have a good game. But sometimes if you have a game that's not so good in handling narrative control, maybe if you try to put narrative control into D&D or Dragon Age, but you have players that are used to it or like it, you might have a good game. But I don't want to it's too easy, I think, to say that it depends on player maturity. Because in my Portuguese language podcast, maturity is a hot button. That's how I say it in English, a hot button.
Yeah.
Okay. So maturity is a hot button. And it's one of those things that you say that everybody needs to have it, but nobody knows how to measure it. It's like having sense, having good sense. Everybody needs to have it, but nobody seems to have it. So do you think it depends more on the game, more on the players? It depends 100% on the game, 100% on the players. What's your take on it?
Okay, so here is my magic formula. Write this down, Marcelo. Write this down and record it and spread it out the world so everyone will know. Game with Sean Nittner and your game will be awesome. I'm just kidding. Okay, so I think there's three components. One, first off, to address you mentioned D&D. System matters. Absolutely. I've played D&D 4 several times. I haven't gotten a chance to play next yet. I wanted to, but I've played 4 several times, and no matter how much I try to make it about a story and about the characters and their dilemmas, the game sucks me in because it is a tactical miniatures game. That's what the game is, and it's very, very good at that. And it's enjoyable and it's fun, but it is not really I'm not gonna say it's not a role playing game, because I think the term role playing game is very vast and wide, and I don't want to start trying to narrow it down. But it's not the kind of game that encourages you or is going to help you deliver an awesome narrative. That's just not what it does, and it's not really what it says it does either. So I'm not blaming it. I think people walking into D&D 4th with the expectation of telling high drama stories are fooling themselves. System matters. It absolutely matters, and system informs play. You're going to do what the mechanics of the game tell you to do, and so if the game is telling you to make difficult decisions and put yourself in danger and expose yourself to danger and risk horrible consequences to achieve narrative goals, like Burning Wheel does. Burning Wheel says you get rewarded when you write down a belief and then you pursue it against all odds. That's how the game reinforces. That's the game mechanics reinforcing a particular style of play. Then that's what you're going to do. If you're told if you kill stuff and do the most damage and take the least hit points, least amount of damage and collect the most loot, and you'll get XP and level up and have more cool powers, then that's what you're going to do. So absolutely, it's like expecting someone to play a board game and start role playing. Like, it might happen. Somebody might start. I used to play Magic the Gathering with this guy, and he'd role play out every single character, every single card he played. He'd be like, "And I summon a mighty fireball that tears up your lands and burns your people, and they're sent screaming into the fields on fire," as he'd cast fireball. And the guy was awesome, but he was really 1 in a million. Like, nobody else does this. And playing games of Magic with him took forever because he had a story behind every card. And I loved him, but I was like, sometimes I'm like, David, can you just play the card so I can go? So it can be my turn. Because he just, So yeah, the game you're playing absolutely affects what you're going to do. So that's number one. System matters. 2. Social contract is a really terrible term because you never once make a contract. I've used it many times, but the more I use it, the more I think it doesn't really. I've never sat down and said, Marcelo, you and I are going to play a game. We are going to write up a social contract. Nobody does that. They talk about the game they're going to play. They talk about their expectations, and they talk about what they want to see. But nobody ever talks about it in a binding way. So I think the term is, I don't know, it needs some help. It needs some updating. But nevertheless, I'm going to use it because it's the best term I've got right now. And I think your social contract has an enormous amount to do with the game. If you can't in advance figure out what gets people excited, you're like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to blow up bugs. You're like, what part of blowing up bugs sounds fun to you? The part where I shoot them and their heads explode. You're like, awesome, let's play some 316 because that's what you do. You blow up bugs in this game. You're space marines and you blow up bugs and your kill count matters. Like, but if you say, I want to blow up bugs, and you're like, what is exciting to you about bugs? It's like, well, my family got killed by bugs and my father's been abducted and I have daddy issues that he wasn't there for me when I needed him. And you're like, maybe that's not the best game for you because you sound like you want to explore your character's depths and their personal issues, and maybe we should find a game, or we should just know that while we're playing that this game is going to be about your character growth. And I think getting those things out in the open, not so that they never change, but so that they're known and can change is really important. Like, I think you set the expectations, and then when you go against them, you look at them again and go, is this still what we're doing? Is this still what our game's about? But it's got to be something everybody's engaged in. I really think it's important to spend a session or two before the game starts. And I don't just mean like character creation. I mean like sitting around and like bullshitting. So you spend the session talking about what the game's going to be like. You know, what are the elements that you want to see in the game? Do you want to see characters personally developed? Do you want to see interpersonal relationships? Do you want to see mystery and exploration? Do you want to see people fighting for, you know, what they believe in? Do you want to see killing stuff? Do you want to see solving puzzles? You know, what kind of things important? And then for me, the next step, and this is where I can really tell if people are like gelling, is I say, okay, don't make characters. We're not making characters right now. We're going to talk about the cast of this game, like who should be in the game. Like in this story, what do you need? You need a captain and an engineer and a science officer and a doctor and and you need a cynic and a believer and all these different things. You know, what is it you need in the show or in the game to tell this story? And then once everyone's kind of described what they need, I say, okay, now pick one of those to play, because now we've established these archetypes that we know are tied into the story. And if people all can agree on a cast and all can agree on like who would be there and what we would need and get excited about playing them, then I think that they're already investing into the collective story. If somebody walks up and be like, here's my street samurai and he has 16 dice on his monofilament whip to kill you, I'm like, dude, you haven't invested at all in this game. You're just showing me your character, but I don't know that character is at all tied into the story. So the first one was system matters. The second point was making a social contract and setting expectations. And the third one is absolutely your players. Like you know, I've done all these things and had players just totally surprise me and just dive right in and be awesome. And like we play Fiasco and they immediately throw it down with some crazy scene of like the two of us in bed having a fight about what happened that night at the cocktail party. And I'm like, oh my God, where did this come from? That's awesome. Great. Totally. I was absolutely staring at that one girl at the cocktail party. It's uncomfortable right now because we're both lying naked under the sheets. Yeah, let's go. Let's have that conversation. And I've also had people that just sort of freeze up and don't know how to respond and don't really want to take part in the conversation. Like when we're talking about what would be involved, they don't have anything to say and they don't really want to be asked those difficult questions. And, I think if you see people kind of freezing up early on and not really wanting to contribute, it's probably a pretty good sign that they are not going to then dive in. I mean, I could be wrong. And I have been mistaken. I've taken someone's been really quiet for a while, and then once they felt kind of comfortable, dove in, and I was really impressed. But yeah, I certainly don't want to say like, get good players, because I know that's, like you said, that's a hot button. But the player's investment in the game that that you want to play is huge. If the other people sitting around the table want to play the same game you want to play and they're all excited about it, it's going to be way better than if they have a different game in their head that they want to play and you end up playing like 2 or 3 or 4 different games, or they're fighting you on that game and they're trying to play something else and they're constantly challenging you, or they're just disinterested. So instead of saying get good players, I'll say get players who are excited about the same things that are exciting you in a game. Is that fair?
Yep. So do you think it's risky to play a game that has narrative control at a convention with players you haven't ever seen in your life?
I do it all the time. I run games like Apocalypse World. It's one of my favorite con games to run. And Apocalypse World gives me just sort of what I consider the right amount of leeway to say, like, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'm totally within my bounds to stomp on you for that question if I feel like it's like leaving the scope of the game we're playing. Like if you're playing core Apocalypse World and I say, how many bullets do you have? That's a question I like asking characters. Just like to see the answer. I'd be like, do you have like a handful? Do you have like a case full? Do you have like a pallet of bullets? And if they're like, I have a bullet emporium, I'm like, yeah, awesome, you have a bullet emporium, until some asshole blew it up and now you're in the smoking remains of it. So how many bullets do you have left? Because scarcity is ever present in Apocalypse World. So it doesn't really matter whether they tell me they're a handful or a barrel full. The point is that it's limited. And when someone tries to give me an answer that is unlimited and defies scarcity, the Apocalypse World totally gives me all the tools to be like, to then question either why is that such a unique and special thing that is not scarce? Like how is it that something isn't scarce? And therefore what 8,000 cannibals and mind bending freaks out there want to get it because it's one thing that isn't scarce? Or how do I make it scarce? So that game in particular, I think I feel very confident going to a convention and running it because I know that I can always establish the game's principles of barfing forth the apocalyptica and making the characters' lives interesting. I think scarcity makes their lives interesting, so I enforce scarcity. It's always something. People are always running out of stuff, and they always need stuff, and that pushes conflict and drama because when you need stuff and someone else has it and they don't want to give it to you, boom, you have a situation. So for me, I've definitely had players that I was kind of lukewarm about, but I think it's paid off. I think more often than not, people, when prompted with interesting questions and given a cool situation or a cool premise to bounce their ideas off of, will more often than not give you back something that's really fun to play with.
Cool. Last question. How much is too much? Do you think is there a situation or is it possible to have too much narrative control and you end up playing a game of Fiasco instead of the game you wanted to play? Because Fiasco it's a GM-less game, right? Everybody controls the scene.
Yeah.
Do you think is there such a thing to have too much narrative control?
Well, I don't know where I see narrative control falling down. I don't know if it's in quantity as much as quality. I guess where I think it can fall down or where I think it can break is when it's done without any constraints or without any limits. So I remember people talking about In a Wicked Age where someone would, they were sort of talking about like whose army would be the first to set out to march on the other one. And somebody's response was they got, sort of their turn to narrate and they're like, my army marches forward and crushes yours and destroys all your people and burns your town and takes it over and leaves you, wrecked and destroyed. And the other person's like, whoa, what? Like that's a little further than I was expecting you to go with that. Like whose army gets to the field first discussion. And so I remember when I was playing Wilderness of Mirrors, I often was kind of frustrated because this is one of my first games where I was playing with narrative control, and when it would go up to the players, if they would simplify the situation to the point of there not being any threats anymore, I'm like, well, now that's cool, but I need there to still be threats in order for this to feel like a spy game. Like it still needs to have tension. So if every single threat I pose at you, you narrate yourself just breezing through, that's cool for like the first 5 minutes of a Bond movie where Bond is just totally badass and he just like beats in the opening scene, he just is perfect and never makes a mistake. But then once the credits roll and we see the Bond girls and it goes to the movie, like the rest of the movie, he has to be like getting punched in the face the whole time. Otherwise the story isn't interesting. And so I think So I apologize as being kind of a roundabout question, but I don't think handing off narration to players, I don't think you can ever necessarily do it too much, but I think you can do it without any guidance, and players can take stories in directions that you sort of are not playing the same game anymore. You're like, where did this go? I don't think we're on the same wavelength. And I think that's the time when you need to, not just as a GM, but just like as a group. I mean, anybody would be like, whoa, I thought we were playing this gritty game. When did you suddenly develop superpowers? Like, I don't think superpowers are appropriate to this game. What's going on? So I think it's really important to make sure that you don't violate the scope of a game. So if you're playing, a really low power, gritty game, suddenly somebody deciding they have superpowers is not appropriate. And everybody needs to kind of check in with that player and make sure that we're all playing the same game still.
That was great. I feel like I put you in the corner, but you hit the ground running with a tough question, and you gave a great answer.
Thank you.
I thank you. That has been a great conversation. I feel now I know a lot more about narrative control, and I'm much more comfortable with it. I hope our listeners feel the same. It's been great talking to you, Sean, and I hope to hear you here soon in the future. Maybe after one more season of narrative control, so you have more new stuff to do, more good experiences under your belt. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. It's a real pleasure being on the show.
You've been listening to Channel2. You can find show notes and contact email at channel2.podcast.com. We're also available through the iTunes Store. Feel free to rate the show and leave a 5-star review. Our theme song, Euphoria, by the Brazilian guitarist Marcus Klein, is used by courtesy of the author. You can find more about him and many other great songs at marcusklein.com.br. Thank you for listening.